All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting for September 26th. Got a few things on the agenda to get through. Quick reminder, this is a Kubernetes community meeting. All the same things apply, including the Kubernetes code of conduct. In general, just be nice to each other and feel free to ask a question at any point. There are no stupid questions. This agenda doc should be editable by anyone. So if you have something you want to discuss, feel free to add it to the agenda or add a comment, whatever it is. With that, let's get started. I added a few notable things that merged recently that would have been easy to miss. First up, Nick's amazing gap that refactors so much about conditions has merged after many comments, lots of review by many people. So thank you, Nick, for pushing through on that one. Pumped to see this one get in. And now we just need to implement it. But I think we're in a pretty good place now. So yeah, thanks, Nick. And thanks to everyone that reviewed it. Next up, not even worth opening, but reference policy has formally been removed. Really straightforward change, but that's a thing that we said we had to do for 060, and it's done now. So yeah. And the final one, I spent a bunch of time talking through this initial change that I made. If you remember, a week or two ago, I made a PR that changed our CRDs for 060 to be in a state that V1 Alpha 2 was effectively not useful or not usable in the sense that it was not served. After talking through that, after looking at the harsh transition that would provide, I backed out one step and have proposed this, which has merged of a marking it as deprecated, marking V1 Alpha 2 as deprecated, so anyone trying to use it gets a warning, but they can still use it. I still highly encourage implementations to go ahead and move to V1 Beta 1 for reads and writes, but this gives you just a little bit more time. Just as a bit of a reference point on GKE, I think I've mentioned this before, we have a policy of not installing alpha APIs. So if you're using the Gateway API as managed by GKE, it won't include the alpha API versions. So just another reason as you go to move towards V1 Beta 1 as soon as you can. But this does give just a little bit more breathing room for any implementations out there. Cool. Yeah, with that, the 051 release. Looks like we've got one approval on this, hoping to get one or two more before we go ahead with cutting 051, but this changelog ends up being relatively small. There's one tiny bit in API spec clarification, a couple webhook cleanups, and a couple conformance cleanups. But I think this will be a good release to get out and hopefully make the way easier for 060 next time. Any comments or concerns on this release?
Looks good to me. I will review post this meeting.
Great, thanks. Okay, we are flying through this. The last one on this milestone phase was to actually look at the 060 milestone. We are getting closer, but the time is ticking down. As we're all aware, we're probably, a couple of weeks before we really need to have the vast majority of these things in. I spent some time going through and pinging people just to see that, most of these have someone assigned at this point. But if there aren't people assigned, please volunteer yourself if you're able to. There are, maybe I'll just highlight a few that are not assigned right now, don't have anyone working on them. One, the publish webhook Docker image to the Kubernetes production registry. I think there are steps, yes, Nick has linked in how this would work. This really just requires someone to go through a few steps to actually make it happen. So if anyone has a few extra cycles, would be a good one to jump in on.
It's a really good getting started one as well, because getting started in Cube in general, because it's going to require making PRs to a few Cube repos. So if you haven't done that before, it's a good chance to have a crack at that. That said, it probably isn't a blocker for 060.
Yeah.
So we can look at taking it out. Same for the admission webbook, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that perspective on both. The webhook one was really just, hey, can we be automatically scanning these for vulnerabilities? I reached out to some people on our GK security team to see what kind of stuff is available in open source Kubernetes already for this. We seem to have infrastructure for most things, but I don't have an answer yet. But if anyone else is familiar with what we're doing in upstream for open source vuln tracking, that would be helpful here. I think we just want to copy whatever exists elsewhere.
I think a lot of it is still in flight, and sort of this is I don't think this is a blocker for 060. I think it's a blocker for GA, but probably not for like beta. It's we need to do this.
I think that's clear enough that let GA could be as soon as 070. So I want to make sure we don't forget about it in that time. Hopefully I did that right. Okay, cool.
Yeah. I think for those two, if we're going to take them out of this release, we should put them into the next one so we don't forget. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then that leaves us with one left. And I would say this is the same thing. I will stubbornly leave this in case someone has time to take this on. But I will be the first to say if it doesn't happen, it doesn't happen, and we can pull it. There's just some weirdness in our shell script around verifying examples that I would love a better solution for. This is not something that needs to block, but it would be nice to fix.
Yeah. Candace pointed out that there's no issue for backend properties. No, there's not. There is a gap number for it. That was a 1282, I think. But it's not blocker for the release, so we haven't put it in the release. If we can get it in before then, that would be great. But let's come back to that. I think Candace, you added that at the end of the agenda. When we talk through it, let's see if there's any kind of MVP that we can fit in, and then we can try and add that and add some kind of issue to track that back to the milestone. But yeah, thank you for calling that up. Okay. I think everything else is covered here. I think at least 4 of the remaining open issues are related to status. So once that gap gets in, we'll be good. I don't know if there's a better way to represent that in here. I thought about, only leaving the gap in and then removing the other ones from the milestone, but I don't know if that really helps or not. I think the PR that I put in to do the thing will fix all those issues. I'll just have it fix all those issues. So
that'll be great.
It'll just close out 5 out of the 11 issues. So
yeah,
that percentage
that works. Sounds great. Okay, cool. All right, that's all for the milestone. Is there anything else other than backend properties that we might be missing in here? All right, I will leave it at that. Thanks, everyone. Okay, so the last one is, the last one that I added to the agenda. I definitely have lots to talk about with Candace's proposal next. I came up with a weekend project type thing that I think everyone has said we should do, but no one had the time to do. But there's a very basic CLI tool that basically reads ingress resources from a cluster and converts them to HTTP routes and gateway. And it is ugly, but it works, at least for me on my cluster. So, that's a thing. once I got it working, I was trying to figure out where exactly it should live, and what its scope should really be. So I'll talk about the scope first. I think the idea should be that it should read ingress resources from YAML or a cluster and have the same options for output. So you can either write to YAML, which is far safer, or if you really trust the tool, you could have it write right back to your cluster, but I don't know that I recommend that for many people. With that said, I think we really would need to limit this to just a subset of specific implementation annotations, but not, there's so many ways we could expand this. So it was very difficult to maintain. But if we just start with just the ingress spec and maybe some annotations, that would go a long ways, I think. But all of this is to say, I need a place to open source this properly. And I think the best place is a Kubernetes SIGs repo. Does that sound reasonable to anyone else? Is anyone interested in being involved in that?
It sounds pretty reasonable to me. I think Sanjay from Contour had talked about doing the same thing. So yeah, I think it's definitely come up before. It'd be really good to have a sort of standard place to go, especially for the ingress one. I think it would also be really nice if there was some way, that we could like make it that people could fork it to have their own, to write their own like CRD to gateway thing. Like I know from Contour, we always wanted to write a HTTP proxy to gateway API converter, and like it'd be really nice if there was some relatively easy way to help people do that, either building it into that tool or letting you fork it and add your own one or something. But yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So this is just a baseline. I think there's a lot of room to expand and make it better. And I think everybody has said at various points that they want to build this. So I wanted to have some basic thing that works.
We should throw together, like, I think this is worth creating an issue and then just throwing together the requirements of like, hey, we generally think, for example, one of the things that seems clear to me is like, it should be importable as a library so people can extend it, like versus just like a standalone controller that can only do one thing, like things like that.
Yeah. That seems like a good goal. That feels to me like something that could, if we agree that this should necessitate a new project, that could be one of the things that is part of founding that new GitHub project, defining the goals for it. Costin?
Yeah, the two issues. One, I put it in comments that it may need to be a controller because people create ingress resources dynamically. But I think the biggest problem is with all the annotations that people use in ingress. I think we need to prioritize creating policy attachments for all those annotations, or import the annotations as kind of poor man's policies going forward. I don't know what. I was looking, for example, at persistent session annotation in Nginx and a few others to figure out how to do in Istio. And I don't know what is the plan. I mean, if you are doing this kind of conversion, what will happen with them?
Yeah, so I don't want to set expectations too high. This is a weekend project. This is really just ingress spec to gateway at current state. I would like to open source it because I think it's broadly useful, but it is not a perfect project in its current state. What I would say is that even if you're going from ingress spec to gateway spec, without any annotations, there's still some things that get lost in translation. It is not a perfect translation. So there's a set of warnings. I would say anything that automates this process is going to be, like if it's a controller per se, it's going to be risky. there's, and then I tried, I took some Nginx ingress annotations and others and translated those, but it's a subset, a small subset of Nginx ingress annotations that can even be translated over to the spec as it exists today. So it's also, it's a good reminder that there's still plenty more work that we can do. Not that our goal is to support every ingress annotation out there, but there's still more we can do.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a very good start, and it's great that you start. I mean, I'm just saying that it will be very useful while you are doing, or people who are doing this, to make a catalog of the annotations that they find and try to translate and prioritize those for adoption as policy attachments and kind of feedback into the APIs that we have here.
Yeah, I should definitely reemphasize that in my mind, policy attachment is intended to be used for things that you can't put into like structured fields inside the resource, or that need like the override and default behavior that we describe in the policy attachment thing. Like, we shouldn't be using policy attachment first for stuff. We should be like finding a way to put it in the API first if possible. Or you build a policy attachment first to show how like a change would work or something like that. But like, I think, like I'd really like us to sort of, I think the leaning too heavily into policy attachment is a good way to end up with a very balkanized like landscape here, that where everybody supports their own sets of policy things, and you can't move between things. So we should try really hard to make sure that we put things into the specs of the resources as far as possible, and only use policy attachment when we really need to. And again, we kind of built that with the idea that it's for setting the things that you want to say, like, for all of the things in this gateway, it must be TLS 1.3 or something like that, right? Like, or it must have this, that sort of thing. Like, that's what the policy attachment thing is really intended for. I know that it's on my list to do, to sort of write up, to put a little bit more of that context into the policy attachment docs, because there's not a lot of examples sort of in the wild yet. But yeah, I just wanted to remind everybody that like it's much better to have that stuff be present in the spec rather than in a separate meta policy.
I think there is some disconnect here, or some confusion. Either I'm confused, or probably I'm confused. So there are two things that are, when I'm talking about policy attachment, I'm not talking about vendor attachment or custom, vendor-specific attachment. I'm talking about official APIs that can be defined by the working group, because we cannot put everything in HTTP route. And right now we have gateway and HTTP route. So there is backend policy, which is a perfect place to put some stuff, but there will be need for some other resources where you put the annotations that currently are used in Ingress. That's and they definitely need to. I completely agree with you. They need to be defined by the working group as proper CRDs with all the review and everything else. But there are difference between vendor specific. Each vendor define its own, and some things that.
Yep. Yeah, sure. And like, I think the one of the reasons that Rob and I suggested building policy attachment the way we did is so that it's possible for vendors to like make their own policy resource and be like, I think we should do it like this, and this is how it will work. But then with the intent being that, we end up where it's possible, we end up with common ones. There are some things where it's not possible. Again, the canonical example is timeouts. You can't have a project like a gateway API timeout policy because every data plane does timeouts differently. So you need to have like an Envoy timeout policy and an Nginx timeout policy or something like that, right? Like, but you can't have one that sits in this project that generically defines timeout policy. So yeah, I think so that it's not so much, it's not only vendor specific, it's also like data plane specific. But yeah, so that's the point that I was trying to make there, is just, like I'd really, yes, I agree that like vendor specific policy stuff is a good way to end up in the same place as annotations. And that's why I'm like, let's be careful. Let's be very measured about what we make into like official policy things, is all I'm trying to say. We should try where possible to not use policy. We should use spec fields wherever it makes sense. That's all I was trying to say.
Just not to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I'd agree with what you're saying, Nick. Just, we spent time going into timeouts, I think was a good example, or retries and these kinds of things. And the variation between even just Envoy and Nginx and what was supported there's very little overlap. They very similar, but it's hard to build a spec around things that have just different behavior. But if you look at the current implementations of this API, a huge portion are based on Envoy, and another chunk are based on Nginx. And so even if we can agree that here's how you do it for Envoy and here's how you do it for Nginx, as an example, that's going to be a huge win compared to one per every implementation. So
I completely agree. I was looking even more about things that are common between Nginx and persistent session, for example. How do we declare that the particular service is using sticky sessions or persistent sessions? That's kind of the hot debate right now in Istio community. And obviously, Nginx has an annotation. There is AJ proxy. I mean, there are 4 or 5 annotations that kind of do the same thing. We're adding yet another one for Istio. So that's probably a place where common. It's just an example. I mean, I'm not saying that. And it may be useful to be prescriptive about it. I mean, it's to say how it should work with a gateway. And then if there's some implementation specifics, then no, we'll deal with that.
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. One is, Rob, thanks for this project. I think this has been on everyone's mind, and it's great that we're getting started. It did bring up this interesting rabbit hole about how do we support all the stuff that Ingress has reminded us of. I recommend making that itself its own topic versus having it nested under Rob's project, just from agenda perspective, because I think we could go talk about that for quite a while. I wanted to make sure we get to the next one.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I think I agree that we should park this one and yeah, talk about it another time. But yeah, as I said, I think that there's definitely more to talk about here. So yeah, let's roll on to the next topic, Rob.
cool. Thanks, everyone. Good discussion. I'll go through the process.
Mikhail had a question. Mikhail had a question in the chat about, are there any plans for writing a guide from migration from Ingress to Gateway and some general guidance for migration?
I mean, I think that would be awesome. We just need someone to volunteer. Hopefully this kind of tool will make that a little bit easier. Shane and I are giving a KubeCon talk in a month approximately on that very topic. So maybe we can translate some of our content there into a guide as well. This tool was inspired by that talk happening. So yeah, hopefully we can provide a cleaner path. But if you already have some thoughts together or want to take this one on, we can always use help. Yeah, good question. All right, Candace, I think you're up next on the backend properties proposal. I know you've been working towards something like for this GEP, and you shared a doc last week, I want to say, and maybe we can go through it today and just talk through the different options you're thinking of.
Yes, definitely. So my first option, which you guys reviewed, was not quite what we had in mind, but now Nick has made another review, and I think things will change again. So I was hoping that in the third review I could put it into a PR.
Yes,
a GEP PR. Okay, but I think
it would be really useful to talk through what you've got here, because I think the process that you've gone through here is actually really common for people for when you want to add something to an API like thing. And so I think it's worth sort of walking through the things that you looked at and like why those are like where those are not ideal. And because it's a really easy thing, like it's the same thing that I did the first time I tried to add something to an API like this. And so like, because it's so common to sort of walk through this process, I think it'd be good to walk through it with everybody. And then I can sort of give my reasons why I'm like, oh, I think we could do this better. And that way, we don't have everybody having to sort of go do 3 rounds of going backwards and forwards, which I'm really sorry for, by the way.
Oh, no problem. Do you want me to say anything about this, or you guys are gonna drive the?
Yeah. So walk us through like what your thoughts were on like why you sort of did things this way. And yeah, I think that then we can talk about like what are my reasons for saying I think we should do this differently.
Yeah. Okay. So in the first iteration of this that I came up with, I thought I was interpreting the gap to the letter, but I wasn't really. So my idea was that I was to make it as generic as possible. So it starts with just this map of capabilities, where the name of the capability is mapped to a backend object capability, which is just a group kind name value, which is a pattern that I had seen pretty often in Gateway API, and we don't use it very often, but Gateway API is using it, and I can understand the reason why, because you want to, this has to appeal to a lot of people who've already implemented and are using Gateway API. So it turns out that was, so if you go on a bit further, it may be easier to understand what the heck I'm thinking of if you actually look at the examples. So here's a backend capabilities list that just has TLS re-encrypt on it. And there's this TLS re-encrypt is the map entry string. And this is a list of the backend capability object refs, I think I called it, or something. So there's version, client cert, private key, CA certs, backend cert. And then I thought if anybody had any fields that were not listed in here already that they needed to use as a part of their implementation, then they could just add another name value pair to extend that with a particular field that they need that's not represented in this list. So it turns out that's a little bit too generic. And I think, Rob, you mentioned that it probably would be better, and then I think I interpreted that wrong as well. Probably would be better to make these into more structured structs, not just maps of the backend object capabilities, but actually fully defined fields in the structs that represent TLS re-encrypt, WebSocket, protocol, and anything else that we want to put in the first iteration. So yeah, that'll be a lot harder to do because you need to know everything that's going to be there ahead of time, because you wouldn't necessarily want to extend those the way those structs are later. You really need to know ahead of time what would be the values in each of these capabilities.
Yeah, thanks for running us through it, Candice. I think this comes down to the stuff that people have learned from like core Kubernetes resources and stuff like that over time. And so the first pattern that you've got there, the sort of the map of string to struct, is really attractive for all the reasons you talk about, right? Like that it's really easy to add new values, and it's really easy to extend. The biggest problem with that is that it's really easy to extend. So like for a thing where we're trying to make it so that we want people to, like, we want it standardized and we want people to be doing the same things, like having it be too easy to extend is actually not good, in the same way that, because that's when you end up with like annotations everywhere or things like that, right? And so I completely agree that is the easiest way to make something that's like really easily extensible. But because we're trying to do a thing that's, we actually want there to be a little bit of friction to extend, like, in that you need to come together with other people and agree on what the common behavior is before you can extend it. Mm-hmm. And so that's why something a bit more like what we're talking about in the second one is slightly more attractive, because it sort of makes you come and talk to everybody, and people implementations can't go and like do their own thing and then end up making that sort of their standard, and then end up with everyone not able to interoperate because everyone's done it in slightly different ways. Mm-hmm. And it kind of sucks having to go and like talk for like 3 months about like what exactly is TLS re-encrypt or something like that, right? It kind of sucks, but what that means is that you end up with something that is like the implementable common denominator. I don't want to say lowest common denominator because it's often like quite a bit higher than you would expect, but it's like the thing that everybody can implement. John.
Sorry, this was like for next topic. So if you want to finish this up,
yeah, okay, sure. Yeah, so and so like so I think that's sort of the reason in my mind for the first one. I think in the second one, the thing that I was thinking when I originally wrote the GEP was about having it be like a reference to a meta resource that sort of wraps the service that then holds these things, so that, and that's what tightly binds the service to the back end stuff to the service, and also it gives you the property that you don't need to define it on every HTTP route. Whereas I think that so if you're defining a service in multiple HTTP routes, then putting it as like a meta resource means that you don't need to do it lots of times every time you reference it in a HTTP route. That said, I think the thing that you writing this out sort of really made clear to me was that like maybe I'm overestimating how much people are actually going to do that, right? Like, and maybe it's better to put it in a HTTP route and have it be like a thing that you do as part of the HTTP route definitions, because that's really what it is. I think John's probably got some stuff to say about like how that might play into the gamma efforts, but like I think that's the big question between like the option 2 that you proposed here and like the putative option 3 that I was talking about, which is like having a meta resource. Is the reason you would do that over what you've got here is to sort of have it so that you can own a service and some sort of service wrapper object, and then anybody, you included, who refers to that service can sort of refer to the service wrapper object and know that all of the settings will be picked up. And if you change the settings, more importantly, you change them everywhere where they're used. So if you've got like 10 HTTP routes, you can change it once and it's all done. How often will people be using 10 HTTP routes to one service? I don't know, right? So maybe it's not worth us doing that. So I probably talked enough. John, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, just like kind of a high level note. And sorry, I didn't read the whole doc. I don't seem to have access to it. So this may not be super in-depth comment, but one thing we see a lot is that a lot of times the backend properties are defined by the service producers, not the service consumers. I don't have much more to say about that. I don't have a concrete suggestion on how that should look, but I think that's a use case that's at least worth exploring or talking about.
Sorry, everybody. We have it set up at work. If I use a Google Doc, I can only share it one by one with certain email addresses. I can't share the link and have it be, like there's no way for me to group share it. I guess I could have made it in my own. I didn't realize this when I started. I've never shared outside of our company. So, well, not widely outside of our company. So, yeah, I can add it. I can add anybody who wants access to it. But after we talk about it here, I am going to put this put the resulting agreement into a PR, and then we can talk about it more there. The reason I had it in a Google Doc was I've never done one before for this group, so I just wanted to have a little chit chat back and forth before I actually embarrassed myself with a pull request.
I should be clear, you have absolutely not embarrassed yourself with this, right? Like, this is really good work. And again, sort of me being picky about it, I'm sorry, is not a reflection on like the work that you've done. It's just like there's stuff that you don't know until you start trying to do this. And don't use map of string to struct is one of the sort of the guideline, the API guidelines that is really easy to miss. And everyone does to start with, me included. So yeah, don't feel bad.
So John and Keith, if anybody else who wants access now, I can try to set it up, but I expect that we'll go through this pretty quickly. And if you can't see it on here, I'll definitely set it up if you want. Yes.
One thing that we could try next time though is one of us who has unrestricted accounts, we could create you the doc and then give you edit access, and then we can share it to just the whole Kubernetes dev or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, everybody.
No, it's fine.
No,
it's gonna happen.
You're not. Yeah, we have the same restrictions and we have funny workarounds here. You're not the only one. It is an annoying thing to deal with.
Okay.
So go ahead.
Well, okay. So option 2 took it a little bit further, and I changed it to just be a backend ref spec as a part of the backend ref struct, which only has as its other object backend object reference and await. So, and then that is defined. The spec itself is defined as a listing of the actual items that we might want to add in there, re-encrypt WebSocket protocol, and I guess we would just keep adding more as we go on, as we want to add more different backend capabilities. So that would mean that people couldn't extend it on their own. Yes, we would all have to agree before this got extended. There would be some guardrail in place before anything changed in here, and just a listing, just a translation into what we would see in a struct, as opposed to a map string to structs listing.
Yep.
And
in this case, I think the biggest change, in addition to the fields here, is that you've moved, if I'm understanding this correctly, you've moved this to HTTP route, right? Like this is extending backend ref on HTTP route. Did I get that correct?
Yeah, I thought the other one was as well.
Yeah, both of them are extending backend ref.
Okay, got it.
Route, so yeah,
got it.
Was that something that you were expecting? Is that where the problem lie, or?
I think that's what, as I said, I think that's where sort of one of the definitional things we sort of need to agree on comes down, is that, is this the responsibility of the person who owns the HTTP route or owns the service, and is that always going to be the same person? And so that's the thing that we need to sort of say, yep, okay, yeah, we can be pretty confident that the person who owns the HTTP route is the person who owns the service. And so it doesn't matter that, and there's probably only going to be one or a small number of HTTP routes like with a service as a backend. In that case, it's fine to have it be the HTTP route, because it means you're not adding a whole nother resource to hold this information. If we think that people might want to have the person who owns the HTTP route and the person who owns the service be different people, then it probably makes more sense to have something that the person who owns the service can more tightly control, and thus like a separate object might be useful. That is a little bit analogous to what John was saying about like producers and consumers. Like if you think that people are going to be making HTTP routes to sort of consume other people's services, it doesn't feel like that would be the case to me. It feels like the person who owns the HTTP route is probably going to be the service owner most of the time. Is just my sort of initial think about it.
And I'd also, I think all your points are spot on, but I'd add one other consideration here, and that is, does the underlying thing that's provisioning that backend have a way of configuring, say, timeouts differently depending on the route the request is coming from? For example, some systems you may only be able to have one timeout configuration, whatever, for that backend service, as opposed to other systems where you're basically creating a separate copy for each one. So at least in some systems, it seems possible that you may only be able to configure this kind of config once per service. And so having it, in every HTTP route, anytime a backend ref is specified, especially if you have, 5 routes, could become complicated if those vary in some way.
Yeah, I think, John, you put a thing in the chat saying need both. Is there any way you could?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to do too many things at once. Yeah, I was saying it's like, Rob, you're right, that is complicated. I don't know if it's necessarily a blocker, because you could in theory make multiple backends with just the settings different. And maybe it's, implementation specific. Like when we looked at policy attachment, we were like, here's all the places you can attach to. And I think we talked about this exact problem. And we're like, yeah, it's fine. If this implementation can attach to all of them, this one just these ones, like no problem. So it's possible that something like that's needed here. What I meant by my obscure comment was that I think in some cases, like I mentioned, it's useful to have producer-oriented config, but it's absolutely on the route level, I think is useful as well. Like for example, the backend may say, I don't know, use TLS or something. But whether or not we actually want to add TLS is dependent on where we've come from, right? Maybe it's already is TLS encryption, we're just passing it through, for example. I mean, that one, maybe we could say we're smart to figure it out, but I'm sure there's other cases that are like that, right? So not all these settings, like the backend usually has a lot of say in it, but maybe they're not the only way that it's used.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there's definitely some confusion here because we use the example of TLS in the policy documentation. So to my mind, the one of the advantages of doing the putting this in the backend ref one is being able to have a place where you say, okay, if you're making a policy to set like the TLS version, your policy is like messing with this field, right? Like it's overriding the value of this field, or defaulting the value of this field, right? So you can say at the gateway level, we're going to default the value of TLS to version 1.3, but you can override it inside your HTTP route by setting the field, the field in the backend ref spec struct to in the TLS part of that to 1.2, right? Like you can override it at that individually at that level, but if you don't say anything, then you're going to get TLS v1.3, right? Like that's how I sort of envisioned the policy working. And the thing that you can do then is that the person who owns the gateway can attach a policy to the gateway to say it's TLS v1.3 and you can't override it. That's what the override idea behind policy is. You can say, no, you can't step this down to 1.2. Sorry, end of story. Because sometimes that's what you want. You want to be able to say, I'm sorry, if your app doesn't do 1.3, then your app is not running in this cluster, something, right? Like we need to make sure we handle that sort of thing. And that's what policy attachment is for. But the thing that I like about putting in the HTTP route is actually that, it's a very clear association, right? There's a very clear relationship. If you're overriding this at the gateway level, that's saying we're overriding this HTTP route level setting, backend ref level setting up here because someone who controls it up here is doing it, right? That's what the thing. I think, yeah, and the and that's so in some ways, like having it in the HTTP route is good, in that it's a very clear relationship. I think Kostin said in the chat that HTTP route is not a good place for setting connection settings, and like, yeah, I agree. It's kind of like, in my mind, it's owned by it's like a service setting, right? Like it should really, ideally, that setting should be on the service resource. But we all know we can't change the service resource because it would take a year or more and be very contentious because adding more things to service is very hard. So like that was why my thought was, hey, we'll have a wrapper resource that wraps service, and then that will make that part easier. Kostin.
Well, sorry for repeating myself, but that's what policy attachment is for. And I don't think we need to change service for Gamma or for this purpose. It's sufficient to define a resource that acts as a policy attached to the service. I don't know if we already define service as an attachment point or not, but I think we do. And that policy would be the TLS attachment policy or whatever. It will be a standard resource defined just like here, and that will define properties of the service without having to change service. I think it will be much cleaner than putting in route, because in route there are all kind of confusion. I mean, you have two routes pointing to the same backend, or it gets crazy, even for a user to understand how it affects, because it's not natural, basically.
So
you go first, Rob.
Thank you. Sorry, just a couple things here. I personally agree that I would prefer for this not to be in route. I would prefer another home for it. I I'm not sure I see. So policy attachment, at least as it's defined today, comes with overrides and defaults and the ability to attach at multiple levels. And I'm not completely clear that's useful for the capabilities we're talking about right now. The idea of TLS reconfiguration, the protocols that a backend supports, those kinds of things don't feel like there's something like you want to define at a higher level and then override further down the stack, right? They seem pretty specific to a service or a backend of some sort. So my own bias here would be to have a resource that is really just a decorator on top of a service. It just extends service and it exists for that purpose and nothing else. Open to other perspectives here, but that's my bias right now.
I completely agree. I mean, I say, but again, when I say policy attachment, I don't necessarily mean the policy resource with overrides and whatever. We can define another CRD that has a reference, just like policy or back or HTTP route to the service or decorate or wrap or whatever. I think it was proposed in Gamma as well. It doesn't have to be exactly, with overrides, but the same concept that you attach to the service instead of having to wait for service to add new fields or.
Yeah, so I think that's what I was talking about when I talk about a meta resource or like a binding style resource. I think for me, and I think it sounds like maybe Rob is on the same page here, I would like to reserve the use of the phrase policy attachment to sort of be that behavior where you have something that makes sense with the hierarchy of gateway API resources and has the defaults and the overrides. So like, I think that a way to say this is a policy attachment is a meta resource in that it binds to another resource and influences the function, but not all meta resources are policy attachments. Right, so like policy attachment is a meta resource that also has very specific behaviors about defaults and overrides. We spend a lot of time sort of trying to get the language right on defaults and overrides there. And so like, I think that in this sort of thing, because there are so reference grant is also another great example of a meta resource where it's a resource that binds in some way to another resource and modifies its behavior. And so I think that we're going to need to use those meta resource style things a lot. But like, I think, and I think that, again, this is a thing where maybe the policy attachment docs don't make clear enough that it's about that sort of the defaults and overrides behavior, policy attachment. This is a thing that I've been meaning to clean up for a while, but I think now I have a slightly better idea of what I need to say in there, that policy attachments are meta resources. Meta resources bind to other objects and make them and change their behavior. A policy attachment is a meta resource, but not all meta resources are policy attachments. Yeah, does that make sense, Costin? Cool. Okay.
Does it mean that we mostly agree that it should be a separate resource, not HTTP route?
So it makes sense to me. Like I said, that was the thing that I was proposing in a comment that I put on Candace's document, and that's the sort of the option 3 that Candace ended up with. But like, I think I wanted to just talk through the idea of having it on a HTTP route because I thought I had never even considered putting it that way because I went straight to let's have a meta resource. And so I thought it was worth talking about having it on HTTP route. I think that you're right that there are definite sort of downsides of doing that. But Mikhail asks, is it a one-to-one relationship between a meta resource and the resource that's changing? For all of the ones that we have made so far, yes. Does it have to be? Probably not. Does it get real foggy if you start having it be any more than a one-to-one relationship? Absolutely. Like the idea here is if you're going to have these meta resources, you've got to be really clear about which things apply to what and how you know that your thing is working. That's the other thing that you've got to close the loop of like being able to know that everything's working. Sorry, I've talked a lot.
Keith, I think you're up next.
Yeah, what Nick just said really spoke to me. I wanted to call that out. I think we're getting to the point, especially with some of the work that Gamma is going to start doing, as well as this backend property stuff. It feels like it might be helpful to kind of have something resembling a decision tree around what we feel is policy attachment versus some of these other more meta resource based kinds of things. And I think to be fair, like Nick mentioned, a pretty big guiding principle. Like if you need to take advantage of the hierarchy piece of policy attachment, that's a good sign for policy attachment. If it's data plane specific, that's a good sign for policy attachment. What else? And what does that mean concretely as we talk about developing the API? It feels like the current like web page around policy attachment could be augmented a bit, and maybe it's more of a meta resource type. And here are the different meta resources that we have. Here's when you reach for a decorator pattern object like a backend properties if you're going to go in that direction. I feel as we talk about doing these various things, and we have so much flexibility in the API, which is fantastic to have that kind of flexibility. But I also feel the need to start trying to at least have a rudimentary, beginning level of qualifications and kind of specific use cases for each one.
1000% agree.
Yeah,
Rob,
well said.
first, and then I have some more to say. But...
Yeah, cool. Yeah, thank you. So, looking at time, we're close to the end of this meeting. So I want to start wrapping things up. And one of the things that is top of mind, probably for all of us, is that we have a release coming up. We would love to get this or some portion of this into that release, which leaves us with a very tight timeline. This requires a GEP, then requires the GEP being implemented and documented. And we're really looking at a couple weeks, maybe a little bit more to get all that done. My personal advice would be that maybe there's some subset of this that we could implement just to get the resource started. Maybe there are a capability or two in here that we feel like we can define clearly, are going to be non-controversial and widely useful. And we can focus on those and get that in. I think if this is a separate resource or wherever this lives, every intent would be to continue working on it and expanding it with new capabilities. But if we can get that kind of foundation of this is where the config lives, this is what it looks like, and here's a couple starting capabilities, that seems like we might be able to squeeze that into this specific release. But it will be tight. I don't know, Nick, you may have some other thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. So I think, if we want to be able to get something into this release, we need to move pretty fast. I think that we can pretty broadly say, Candace, that there was agreement today that it needs to be a separate resource. I would say let's stick with a very similar behavior to reference grant. Okay, and have like the service sort of service backend meta resource like be a separate resource that has a spec thing that points it to a service, and it can have a GVK and a name but no namespace because it has to be in the same resource as the thing that it's modifying. And then you have like the capabilities thing as a union style structure where you've got like you've got in the option 2 where you've got like TLS backend, WebSocket, and we just add more things to that struct as we come up with additional capabilities that need documenting. If we have, I think something like that is pretty easily definable in a very short amount of time. Is going to work very similarly to what we have with reference grant. I don't think we need to block working on this with us figuring out like some better language around meta resources and policy attachment, all that sort of stuff. I feel like something like that feels pretty good to me, and I would certainly be really good with seeing something like that move very quickly. Now is probably the time for anyone who has big objections to that to speak up, though, because otherwise Candace is going to go off and get cracking on this. And I would really like not to ruin Candace's day yet again by asking her to change directions after we have said go and do something, please.
It's okay. Better to ruin it now than later.
Yeah, true.
I would just echo those thoughts and also say, Candace, if you need help at any point, please reach out. I think between the different maintainers here, we offer basically 24/7. Someone's awake probably. So we got that covered. But also I encourage everyone who's interested in this to prioritize reviewing this as the PRs come in. Our timeline is going to be pretty quick. So if you see a PR that's related to this, review it, because, you know, where we might have waited a week for everyone to have a chance to comment, that may be a couple days with this gap. So if you have thoughts, make sure you get them in as quickly as possible on these PRs.
Agreed.
Okay, I think that may be all for today. Any last thoughts? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Candace, for taking this one on. I'm excited to see where it goes. And yeah, have a great week.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.